This story is about how a poor waitress was fired for spilling soup on a cruel CEO, and what he did next left everyone speechless. In one single moment of exhaustion, Maya's world shattered. She was just a desperate sister, but the ruthless man saw only an inconvenience. He demanded she be fired, stripping away her only hope. But what seemed like the end was only the beginning of a story of redemption that no one could have ever predicted. The crystal chandeliers of the gilded perch cast a fractured, golden light over the controlled chaos of the dinner rush. The air was a symphony of clinking silver, the deep murmur of 100 conversations, and the sharp, punctuated laughter of the city's elite. For Maya, it was just noise, a relentless wave she had been fighting for 11 straight hours. Her feet were twin agonies in her thin-soled shoes, and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion had settled behind her eyes, making the glittering scene swim in and out of focus. She was running on the fumes of yesterday's coffee and the ghost of a memory, the image of her younger sister Lily's pale but hopeful smile. That smile was the only reason she was still standing, still pushing through the fog that threatened to consume her. Every plate she carried, every fake smile she offered was another dollar toward a mountain of medical debt that grew taller with every passing day. She had not slept in what felt like a lifetime, a fact that made the heavy mahogany tray in her hands feel carved from lead. Across the room, at the most secluded table with the best view of the skyline, sat Alistair Vance. He was less a person and more a monument to cold, hard currency. His suit was a dark slash of expensive fabric against the plush velvet of the booth, his posture an exercise in rigid disapproval. He radiated an icy stillness that seemed to bend the room's chaotic energy around him, a black hole of imperious irritation. He had not come here to dine. He had come to be seen, catered to, and to find fault in the service. Maya could feel his disapproval from 50 feet away. Her path to Table 9, a boisterous party of 8 celebrating a promotion, took her directly past his silent, judgmental island. She steadied the tray, her arms trembling with the strain. Just a few more steps. A busboy, no older than 16, darted out from between tables, his own tray laden with dirty dishes. He did not see her. The slight, almost insignificant bump to her shoulder was all it took. The world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to stretch and warp as Maya fought a losing battle with gravity. She watched, horrified, as one small, elegant bowl of creamy vichyssoise began its inexorable slide. It seemed to float for a moment, a perfect white vessel on a collision course with destiny, before it tipped over the edge. The hot liquid erupted in a wave, splashing across the pristine shoulder and lapel of Alistair Vance's custom-tailored suit. The sound of the porcelain bowl shattering on the marble floor was like a gunshot, silencing the entire restaurant. Every head turned, every conversation died. In the deafening silence, all Maya could see were his eyes, steel, grey and glacial, as they rose from the spreading stain to fix on her face. The look was not one of simple anger, it was one of utter contempt, as if she were a particularly disgusting insect he had just discovered crawling on his sleeve. The heat of the soup was nothing compared to the Arctic chill of his stare, a stare that froze the apology in her throat and shattered the last fragile remnants of her composure into a million pieces. Alistair Vance rose to his feet, not with the explosive rage of a common man, but with a slow, deliberate movement that was far more terrifying. He moved like a predator, uncoiling with a grace that made the ugly, pale stain on his jacket seem like a deliberate desecration of a priceless work of art. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from 1,000 threads of morbid curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. Every diner, from the socialites at the front to the quiet couple in the corner, had become a spectator in Maya's personal nightmare. Their eyes were a physical weight, pressing down on her, pinning her to the spot like a specimen under glass. The blood rushed to her face, a hot tide of shame that burned from her neck to her hairline. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The words, "I am sorry, I am so sorry," were a frantic, silent scream in her mind, trapped behind a wall of pure, unadulterated panic. Vance's cold gaze swept over her, a meticulous assessment of her worthlessness, before he finally spoke. His voice was not loud, yet it sliced through the thick silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, each word a perfectly enunciated instrument of cruelty. "Are you incompetent?" he asked, the question landing not as an inquiry, but as a final, damning verdict. "Get her out of my sight." The restaurant manager, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Dubois, scurried to the table, his face a mask of panicked apology. "Mr. Vance, a terrible accident. Please, allow us to take care of everything." Vance did not even bother to look at him. His eyes remained locked on Maya, a flicker of something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction in their depths. He was not interested in apologies or compensation. He was interested in consequence. "I want her fired," he stated, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing. "Now, I want to see it happen." The finality of the command was absolute. Mr. Dubois' face paled, but he knew better than to argue with a man who could buy and sell this entire establishment before his appetizer grew cold. He turned to Maya, his expression a wretched mix of pity and professional necessity. "Maya," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "please, come with me." The words were a death sentence. The walk from the table to the swinging kitchen doors felt like a mile. Maya was aware of every stare, every whispered comment that rippled through the room in the wake of Vance's decree. She could feel his cold, satisfied gaze on her back the entire time, a final, parting shot of his absolute power. He had not just cost her a job, he had stripped her of her dignity in front of 100 strangers, an act of casual brutality that served no purpose other than to demonstrate that he could. As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the opulent dining room and its silent, judging audience, the fragile thread of her control finally snapped. The world dissolved into a blur of meaningless shapes and sounds, the only reality being the cold, hard fact of her utter and complete ruin. The back alley was a world away from the golden glow of the gilded perch. Here, the only light came from a single, flickering bulb that cast long, distorted shadows against the grimy brickwork. The air was cold and thick with the sour stench of discarded food and damp cardboard from the overflowing dumpsters. The distant symphony of the city, the blare of horns and the wail of sirens, felt mocking, a reminder that the world kept spinning even when hers had just ground to a violent, screeching halt. Maya leaned against the rough wall, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her uniform, a cheap polyester shell that offered no protection against the biting night air. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled envelope, her final paycheck. Mr. Dubois had pressed it into her hand with a muttered, shame-faced apology, the cash for her hours and a pittance for tips amounting to a sum that was both insultingly small and terrifyingly vital. It was not just money. It was rent for her tiny apartment. It was the next copay for Lily's medication. It was the bus fare to the hospital for the next 2 weeks. Now, it was all she had left. A sob, hot and ragged, tore its way up her throat, but she choked it back, swallowing the sound until it became a hard, painful lump in her chest. Crying felt like a luxury she could not afford. Her fingers, numb with cold and shock, fumbled for the phone in her pocket. The screen flared to life, illuminating her pale, tear-streaked face. She ignored the low battery warning and opened her photo gallery, her thumb tapping on the one picture that was her entire world. It was a photo of Lily, taken last summer before the sickness had stolen the color from her cheeks. Her sister was sitting on a park swing, her head thrown back in a moment of pure, uninhibited laughter, her brown hair a wild halo around her face. Her smile was a supernova, bright enough to power a city, bright enough to light up the darkest corners of Maya's soul. Looking at it now was like staring into the sun, a beautiful, blinding pain. A fresh wave of devastation, more powerful than the humiliation, more crushing than the fear, washed over her. Every double shift, every rude customer, every aching muscle had been for that smile. She had built her entire life around the singular goal of protecting it, of keeping it safe, and in one clumsy, exhausted moment, she had failed. The weight of that failure was a physical thing, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "I am so sorry, Lily," she whispered to the unhearing image on the screen, the words a ghost of a sound in the desolate alley. "I failed you." The hope that had carried her through so many sleepless nights evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, echoing void. Rock bottom was not the cold concrete beneath her feet. It was the chilling, absolute certainty that she had no way of climbing back up. The penthouse office of Vance Holdings was a cathedral of glass and steel, suspended 57 stories above the glittering nervous system of the city. Below, the traffic flowed like rivers of light, a silent, beautiful abstraction of the chaos Alistair Vance had spent his life mastering. His world was one of predictable inputs and profitable outputs, of data streams and market forecasts that bent to his will. Everything in this sterile, minimalist space, from the polished chrome of his desk to the single, severe piece of modern art on the wall, was designed for brutal efficiency. There were no distractions, except for one. For the past 3 hours, a persistent, unwelcome image had been short-circuiting his focus. He stared at the quarterly earnings report, a complex tapestry of numbers that should have held his complete attention, but the figures kept blurring, dissolving into a pair of wide, terrified brown eyes. He had reread the same paragraph 7 times. It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was profoundly irritating. The incident at the restaurant should have been a closed loop. An inconvenience occurred. The source of the inconvenience was removed, and order was restored. He had forgotten the waitress's face the moment she was escorted from the dining room. Yet, the memory of her expression remained, a ghost in his machine. It was not her apology or her clumsiness that lingered. It was the moment just before the tears fell, a fleeting, unguarded micro-expression of such raw, abject desperation that it had felt like a violation. It was an emotion too naked, too primal for a public space. It was a data point that did not fit any known metric. He felt no remorse. Remorse was a useless emotion, a sentimental indulgence for the weak. What he felt was annoyance, a deep, simmering frustration with his own mind for its refusal to archive the trivial event. This lingering image was a bug in his perfectly coded operating system, a cognitive anomaly that was disrupting his workflow. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city he owned. He was a man who solved problems. He dismantled them, analyzed their component parts, and reassembled them into a more favorable configuration. This was no different. The memory was a problem. The waitress was the source of the problem. Therefore, to resolve the glitch in his own head, he needed to understand the source. He needed to quantify her desperation, to put it in a box with a label so it could be filed away and ignored. It was not an act of conscience. It was an act of mental housekeeping. He returned to his desk, the city lights reflecting in the cold, polished surface. The feeling was not empathy. It was the cold, clear impulse of a master strategist deciding to finally deal with a minor but persistent irritation on the board. The decision, once made, settled over Alistair Vance like a familiar cloak of absolute control. The irritating flicker of emotional static in his mind receded, replaced by the cool, clean hum of executive function. He returned to his desk, the polished chrome reflecting his impassive expression, and pressed a single button on his console. The connection was instantaneous, the line utterly silent, waiting for his command. On the other end was Evelyn, his executive assistant, a woman so preternaturally efficient and discreet that her existence was more a function of his will than an independent entity. She never asked why. She only delivered results. "That waitress from the restaurant," he said, his voice a flat, toneless instrument of command. He did not need to specify which restaurant. Evelyn would already know. "The one I had fired. I want to know everything about her." Her name, according to the manager's stammered report, was Maya. He did not bother to use her last name. To him, she was not a person but a data set to be compiled. "I want her financials, her employment history, her living situation, any criminal record, any associates of interest. I want a complete profile on my desk by morning. Handle it." The response was a calm, disembodied, "Of course, Mr. Vance," before the line went dead. He had not expected anything else. He leaned back in his leather chair, the soft groan of the expensive material the only sound in the vast office. A sense of order was restored. The untidy, emotional anomaly had been contained and delegated. Now it was merely a task, a problem outsourced to the most reliable component in his corporate machine. He had taken the ghost that haunted him and turned it into a project file, code-named and scheduled for analysis. This act of delegation was a reassertion of his power, not just over his employees, but over the unruly, illogical impulses of his own mind. He was no longer a man distracted by a flicker of conscience. He was a CEO gathering intelligence. The desperation he had seen in her eyes was no longer a haunting image. It was a variable, an unknown quantity that he would soon have a name and a number for. He believed, with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been wrong, that the subsequent report would be mundane, a predictable and boring story of poor choices and unfortunate circumstances. It would be a story that would allow him to neatly categorize her, file away the memory, and finally delete the glitch. He turned back to his monitor, the quarterly earnings report now sharp and clear. With the problem being processed by his system, his focus was once again absolute. The cheerful, brightly colored mural of cartoon animals on the wall did little to mask the sterile reality of the hospital room. The air was thin and smelled of antiseptic and lemon-scented cleaning fluid, a scent Maya would forever associate with fear. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the brittle cheerfulness of her own voice as she read from a worn copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Lily, her small frame nearly lost in the crisp white sheets, listened with an intensity that belied the translucent fragility of her skin. Her spirit, however, remained a stubborn, brilliant flame. She would interrupt with a quiet but firm, "Aslan would never let that happen. a flash of her old, fiery self that both warmed and broke Maya's heart. Maya was forcing a smile so wide it made her cheeks ache, pouring every last ounce of her depleted energy into the performance. She could not let Lily see the chasm of despair that had opened up inside her. The loss of her job was a secret she guarded with a fierce, desperate terror. The door creaked open, and Dr. Evans entered, his kind face etched with a professional weariness that instantly sent a jolt of ice through Maya's veins. He offered a gentle smile to Lily before his eyes met Maya's, and in them she saw the news before he even spoke. He spoke in low, measured tones, his voice a clinical, quiet instrument of devastation. The latest scans were not what they had hoped for. The current treatment was no longer effective. He used words like aggressive progression and limited options. Each phrase was a hammer blow against the fragile wall of Maya's composure. But then he offered a sliver of light in the crushing darkness. "There is one other possibility," he said, his voice cautious. "A new experimental immunotherapy trial. The results in early stages have been remarkable." Hope, bright and blinding, surged through Maya. A trial, a new chance. She held her breath, waiting. "Unfortunately," the doctor continued, his expression tightening with regret, "because it is still experimental. Insurance will not cover it. The cost is, I am afraid, substantial." The number he quoted was astronomical, a figure so far beyond her reality it might as well have been the distance to a star. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. The room seemed to tilt, the cheerful cartoon animals on the wall mocking her with their painted smiles. She looked at Lily, who was watching the doctor with wide, trusting eyes, and the forced smile on Maya's face became a mask of agony. The doctor's words had not just raised the stakes. They had built a guillotine, and the loss of her job was the rope that had just been cut. The quiet, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was no longer a comfort. It was the sound of a clock ticking down the seconds on her sister's life. The chime of the incoming email was a soft, unobtrusive sound in the tomb-like silence of Alistair Vance's office. It was precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, the time he had designated for the delivery of the preliminary report. He swiveled his chair to face the massive, glowing monitor, his movements economical and precise. On the screen, a single, unread message from Evelyn waited with digital obedience. The subject line was a simple, sterile M. Garcia. He opened the attached file. It was a PDF, cleanly formatted, the information presented in a series of dispassionate bullet points that painted a portrait of a life teetering on the brink of collapse. He skimmed the contents, his eyes moving rapidly across the black and white text. The story it told was exactly what he had anticipated. It was a tedious, predictable narrative of modern poverty. There was a list of previous low-wage service jobs, each held for less than a year. There were student loans in default, a small but persistent mountain of credit card debt, and a notation of 2 recent payday loans with predatory interest rates. Her current address was a run-down apartment building in a part of the city he only ever saw from the air. The final section detailed the reason for her financial desperation: a younger sister, Lily, diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. The associated medical expenses were catastrophic, a black hole of debt from which there was no escape. Vance felt a familiar, dismissive curl at the corner of his lip. It was a generic, commonplace sob story, the kind of mundane tragedy that played out 1,000 times a day in the city below him. This was the source of the raw desperation he had witnessed. It was not some unique, profound anguish. It was the garden-variety panic of the financially insolvent. The knowledge was a relief. The glitch in his mind was resolved. The anomaly was explained, categorized, and found to be utterly unremarkable. He had been right all along. She was just another casualty of a system he had mastered, a person whose poor planning and unfortunate circumstances had led her to a predictable end. The memory of her eyes no longer felt like a haunting. It was simply data, now properly contextualized and rendered meaningless. His hand moved to the mouse, the cool, polished surface, a familiar extension of his own will. The cursor hovered over the delete icon. It was time to purge the file, to erase this pointless little narrative from his system and restore his own pristine mental state. He was done with it. The problem was solved. He was ready to click. His finger rested on the cool, brushed metal of the mouse, a single point of contact with the power to erase a life's pathetic summary. The cursor, a sharp white arrow, hovered over the digital trash can. A sense of clean, sterile satisfaction washed over him. The file was categorized, the anomaly explained, the mental clutter ready to be purged. He was about to perform the final, definitive click, an act of cognitive hygiene that would restore his world to its proper, ordered state. But he paused. It was a habit ingrained over a lifetime of meticulous, obsessive attention to detail. No report was ever dismissed, no file ever closed, without one final, comprehensive sweep for inconsistencies. It was the principle upon which he had built his empire. Never leave a single variable unexamined. His eyes, cold and analytical, scanned the document one last time, not with interest, but with the dispassionate scrutiny of a machine auditing its own code. He swept past the predictable list of debts and the grim medical details, his brain barely registering the words. It was all noise, background static, and then he saw it. Tucked away at the very bottom of the final page, almost an afterthought, was a single, italicized line beneath a subheading marked Unverified Ancillary Data. The text was stark, stripped of context, a lone fact in a sea of narrative. Recipient of the prestigious Chancellor's Scholarship for Engineering at Northwood University. Status. Withdrew after first year. The words stopped him cold. His finger froze inches above the mouse. The line of text was a single note of discord in a symphony of predictable mediocrity. It did not fit. It was a logical fallacy, a piece of a different puzzle entirely. The woman, described in the preceding 5 pages, the one who drifted between menial jobs and payday loans, could not coexist with the brilliant young prodigy who had won the most competitive academic award in the state. The two profiles were mutually exclusive. A profound, instinctual hatred for the inconsistency flared within him. The neat, tidy box he had built around the memory of the waitress shattered. The simple, boring story of her life was no longer simple or boring. It was a lie, or at least an incomplete truth, and he despised incomplete truths more than anything else. The satisfaction he had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a sharp, focused intrigue. The glitch had not been resolved. It had just revealed a deeper, more complex layer of code. The waitress was no longer a trivial annoyance to be deleted. She was now an enigma, an infuriating, compelling puzzle that his mind, by its very nature, was now powerless to ignore. The digital ghost of the report still lingered on his screen, the single, anomalous line of text pulsing with a silent, insistent challenge. The city lights below, once a backdrop of predictable patterns, now seemed to reflect the chaotic, unsolved equation that had taken root in Alistair Vance's mind. The irritation was gone, burned away and replaced by something far more potent, a cold, predatory thrill he usually only felt during a hostile takeover. He was no longer swatting at a fly. He was tracking a lion. He jabbed the button on his console, his movements sharp and devoid of their earlier languor. The connection was, as always, instantaneous. "Evelyn," he said, his voice no longer flat and dismissive but a blade sharpened by a new and unexpected purpose. "The preliminary report on M. Garcia is insufficient." A lesser man would have found the statement absurd, but Evelyn simply waited. "Forget the financials," he commanded, the words a clean, decisive slash through his previous instructions. "The debts, the jobs, the pathetic spiral of her finances, it is all irrelevant noise. I want to know about the scholarship. The Chancellor's scholarship at Northwood University." The silence on the other end of the line was one of absolute attention. "I want to know how she won it. I want to know who her professors were. I want you to talk to them. Find the head of the engineering department at the time. Find her academic advisor. I want to know what they saw in her, what she was working on, what her potential was judged to be." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant, glittering towers of the financial district. "And then I want to know why she left. I want every detail. I want a timeline. I want a full psychological and academic profile, from her first day on campus to her last. I want to understand the decision-making process that turns a prodigy into a waitress." The scope of the request was invasive, obsessive, a flagrant disregard for privacy that would have been shocking from anyone else. From Alistair Vance, it was simply a Tuesday. He was no longer trying to delete a memory. He was excavating a life, searching for the single, critical data point that would make the entire illogical narrative make sense. The hunt was on, and he would not rest until the puzzle was solved. "Now," he said, a final clipped command that left no room for interpretation. The line went dead, and in the profound silence of his office, Alistair Vance felt the welcome, familiar hum of a problem that was finally worthy of his complete and total attention. The second report arrived not as a file, but as a dossier. It was a thick, comprehensive document that landed in Alistair Vance's secure inbox, just as the moon began its slow ascent over the sleeping city. This was not a summary of public records. This was a deep dive, an invasive and meticulous piece of corporate espionage turned inward on a single, seemingly insignificant life. He opened the file, and the cold, clinical glow of the monitor illuminated a face that was no longer impatient or intrigued, but utterly, completely absorbed. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the cold chrome of his desk, the world outside his window ceasing to exist. The dossier was filled with transcribed interviews, Evelyn's work a testament to her ruthless efficiency. The first was with a Dr. Alistair Reed, the former head of Northwood's engineering faculty, a man with a reputation for intellectual austerity. His words, stripped of emotion and presented as stark text, were a thunderclap. A once-in-a-generation mind, Reed had stated, not an exaggeration. She possessed an intuitive grasp of theoretical physics that most of my postdoctorate students struggled with. Her solutions were not just correct, they were elegant. Vance scrolled down. Another interview, this time with a younger professor, a woman named Anya Sharma. We gave her a theoretical problem involving quantum entanglement that had stumped a team at MIT for 6 months. Maya solved it. She solved it on a whiteboard in one afternoon. She did not see problems, she saw pathways. She saw the shape of the answer before she even began the work. The report continued in this vein, a chorus of academic superlatives from the brightest minds in the field. Her withdrawal, another professor was quoted as saying, was not a loss for the university. It was a loss to the entire field of applied sciences. The praise was backed by hard data, a perfect 4.0 grade point average, a flawless transcript where every single grade was the highest possible mark. Vance sat back, a slow, unfamiliar sensation creeping into his consciousness. It was a feeling he reserved for the titans of industry, for the brilliant, shark-like minds he occasionally battled in the boardroom. It was respect. The image of the clumsy, terrified waitress in the restaurant was a ghost, a fiction. The woman in this report was a force of nature, a brilliant mind caged in a menial existence. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He was not reading the file of a failure. He was reading the file of a genius who was living the life of a pauper. The injustice of it was not a moral failing in his eyes. It was a gross misallocation of a valuable asset. The question that had driven him was no longer just a puzzle. It had become a profound and deeply unsettling tragedy. The dossier remained open on the screen, a monument to a life he could not comprehend. The question still burned in his mind, a gaping hole in the otherwise perfect logic of the report. Why? The professors had praised her mind, her colleagues had lauded her potential, but none could offer a coherent reason for her sudden, inexplicable departure. It was a loose thread, a single piece of corrupted data that rendered the entire file incomplete. Alistair Vance did not tolerate incomplete files. His fingers moved with practiced speed across his keyboard, his mind operating like a high-speed processor. He opened a second window, pulling up the initial, mundane report he had so quickly dismissed, the one with the debts and the medical bills. He placed the two documents side by side on the vast expanse of his monitor. On the left, a portrait of a genius, a list of academic triumphs, glowing testimonials, a future of limitless promise. On the right, a portrait of a failure, a spiral of debt, menial jobs, a life defined by her sister's catastrophic illness. The two realities were so diametrically opposed, they seemed to describe two different people from two different universes. He began to cross-reference the timelines, his eyes flicking back and forth between the two windows, searching for an intersection, a single point where the two divergent paths might have crossed. He found the date of her official withdrawal from Northwood University, September 12, 2018. He committed the date to memory, a cold, hard fact. Then, his eyes scanned the second file, the grim chronicle of her sister's medical history. He found the date of the initial diagnosis, the day the word leukemia had first entered their lives and shattered their world. September 5, 2018. The two dates hung there on the screen, separated by a mere 7 days, 1 week. In the profound, sterile silence of his office, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The clarity was stunning, absolute. It was not a story of failure. It was not a story of bad choices or wasted potential. It was a story of sacrifice. The brilliant engineering prodigy had not fallen from grace. She had walked away from it, deliberately, to care for her dying sister. She had traded a future filled with accolades and scientific breakthroughs for a present filled with hospital waiting rooms and the desperate scramble for rent money. It was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated transaction, an exchange of one life for another. The cold, logical pieces of the enigma reassembled themselves in his mind, no longer a portrait of a failure, but a stark, terrifying monument to a love so profound it defied all of his known metrics for human behavior. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the oncology ward was an assault on Alistair Vance's senses. It was the scent of managed decay, of a battle being fought with chemicals and quiet desperation, and it offended his deep-seated need for order and control. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, a ghost in an expensive suit, feeling more out of his element than he had ever felt in the most hostile boardroom. The quiet squeak of a nurse's shoes, the distant, rhythmic beep of a machine, the low, muffled sound of a television from a nearby room. Each sound was a testament to a world of chaos and biological betrayal he had spent his life insulating himself from. He had come here for a reason he could not yet articulate to himself. The data was not enough. The dossier had provided the what, but he needed to see the why. His driver was waiting in the black sedan a block away, the engine silent, ready to spirit him back to his world of clean lines and predictable outcomes. But first, he had to close this final, illogical loop. He found the room, number 312, and stood in the shadows of the corridor, looking through the small, square window in the door. The scene inside was quiet, intimate, a small pocket of humanity carved out of the clinical coldness. Maya was sitting on the edge of her sister's bed. The girl, Lily, was asleep, her face pale and still against the white pillow, but Maya was awake. She was more than awake. She was a sentinel, a guardian. In her hand, she held a soft, bristled brush, and with movements of infinite, heart-breaking gentleness, she was brushing her sister's thinning hair. There was no audience, there was no performance. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of the brushstrokes, a silent lullaby of devotion. Vance watched, frozen in the hallway, as the abstract concept of sacrifice, the cold data point he had discovered on his monitor, transformed before his eyes into a devastating, emotional reality. The numbers and timelines in his dossier dissolved, replaced by this single, powerful image. A young woman who had traded a universe of scientific discovery for these quiet, stolen moments in a hospital room. The sight did not compute. It was an act of such profound, illogical love that it short-circuited his entire logical framework. The respect he had felt for the prodigy was now eclipsed by a new, unwelcome, and deeply unsettling emotion for the sister. He was no longer looking at a misallocated asset. He was looking at a force of nature he could not quantify, could not understand, and, most disturbingly, could no longer ignore. He turned away from the window, the image seared into his mind, and walked back down the silent corridor, no longer a man trying to solve a puzzle, but a man about to change the entire game. The black leather of the Maybach's interior was cool against his back, a familiar, sterile comfort that felt a universe away from the antiseptic chill of the hospital. The engine was silent. The car was a soundproof vault, a bubble of absolute quiet, parked on a dark, anonymous street. Outside, the city hummed with a life he was momentarily disconnected from, but inside, the only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of his own breathing. He stared through the tinted bulletproof glass, not at the street, but at the image replaying on a loop in the theater of his mind. The quiet, steady motion of a hairbrush, the fierce, unwavering devotion in a young woman's exhausted eyes, the internal conflict that had plagued him for days, the irritating cognitive dissonance, was finally gone. It had not resolved into warmth or empathy or any of the other useless emotions he so despised. Instead, it had coalesced, hardening into something he understood perfectly: cold, clear, unshakable resolve. The world was a system of assets and liabilities. Maya Garcia was a brilliant, once-in-a-generation asset that was being criminally misallocated. Her sister's illness was a liability that was draining the asset. The equation was that simple. It was an inefficient system, and Alistair Vance did one thing better than any other man alive. He corrected inefficiencies. He lifted his phone, its cold, smooth weight a familiar extension of his will. He did not hesitate, he did not second-guess. He pressed a single number on his speed dial. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, calm instrument of absolute authority. The line was silent, waiting. "Get me Dr. Aris Thorne, the foremost expert in pediatric immunotherapy. Tell him it's Alistair Vance, and his research is about to be fully funded. Then get me the top pediatric oncology team from Johns Hopkins. Not one doctor, the entire team. I want them on my private jet within 6 hours. I don't care what they are doing or who they are with." "You will make it happen." He paused, letting the weight of his commands settle in the silent air between continents. And Evelyn, the girl, Lily Garcia. Her medical care, from this moment forward, is no longer a concern. I am covering everything, every treatment, every specialist, every incidental cost, until she is in full and complete remission. I want a confirmation report on my desk by the time I arrive at the office. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. He had not made a plea or an offer. He had issued a decree, reshaping reality with a few quiet words. He leaned his head back against the cool leather, a profound sense of order restored. The game had been changed, the board had been reset, and he was, once again, in complete control. The walls of Maya's apartment were thin, a flimsy barrier against the sounds of the city and the even louder sounds of her own crushing despair. The small space was clean but worn, every piece of furniture a second-hand relic, every corner filled with the quiet desperation of a life lived on the edge. She was staring at a stack of final notice bills on her small kitchen table, a paper mountain that represented her complete and total failure. Hope was a foreign country she had been exiled from. When her phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number flashing on the cracked screen, her first instinct was to ignore it. It was probably another debt collector, another voice to remind her of how far she had fallen. But some small, exhausted impulse made her answer, her voice a fragile, weary hello. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly unexpected. "Is this Maya Garcia?" the woman asked. "I am calling from the administrative office at the Central Hospital regarding your sister, Lily." Maya's heart seized, a familiar, cold fist of panic clutching at her chest. More bad news. She braced for the impact. What followed, however, was not a blow, but a miracle. "We have had an unexpected, last-minute opening in a new clinical trial," the woman said, her tone businesslike. "An advanced immunotherapy program. The results have been very promising." The words did not seem real. Maya sank into a chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. "A trial," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "But the cost, we could never." The administrator's voice cut through her panic with calm efficiency. "That is the reason for my call. All expenses for the trial, including associated care and accommodation, are being covered in full by a private benefactor. We just need you to bring Lily in tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock for an initial assessment meeting with the team. A team, all expenses covered." The concepts were too vast for her exhausted mind to fully grasp. She numbly confirmed the time, scribbling the room number on the back of an envelope with a trembling hand. The call ended. The silence that rushed back in was different. It was not the empty, hollow silence of despair. It was a sacred, ringing silence, filled with impossible light. She looked at the photo of Lily by her bed, at the bright, carefree smile she had sworn to protect. Tears began to fall, hot and fast. But for the first time in months, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking relief. It was a small miracle, a whisper of grace from a universe she thought had abandoned her. The ground was no longer crumbling beneath her feet. Someone, somewhere, had just given her solid rock to stand on. While Maya cried tears of relief in her tiny apartment, a silent, invisible war was being waged on her behalf across multiple time zones. The moment Alistair Vance's call ended, Evelyn, his assistant, moved with a speed and precision that bordered on the supernatural. For a single, fleeting second, she had allowed herself to be stunned by the sheer, breathtaking scale of his command. It was a command that went beyond business, beyond logic, into a realm of personal intervention she had never witnessed in her 10 years of service. Then, the professional took over. Her fingers flew across a bank of monitors, pulling up secure contact lists and private flight charters. Her first call was to the personal line of Dr. Aris Thorne. It was 3 a.m. in Zurich, but the name Alistair Vance was an incantation that parted the veil of sleep and commanded immediate, absolute attention. The world's leading immunotherapist was not requested. He was summoned. Her next calls were a masterclass in logistical warfare. She spoke to the Chief of Staff at Johns Hopkins, her voice a calm, immovable force against a torrent of scheduling conflicts and prior commitments. Within 1 hour, a team of 5 of the world's most sought-after pediatric oncologists had been pulled from their lives, their patient lists cleared, their bags packed. A Gulfstream G650, sleek and silent as a shark, was diverted from its flight path to Dubai and rerouted to Baltimore, its new mission one of life, not commerce. Simultaneously, another front in the campaign was opened at the Central Hospital. The hospital director, a man accustomed to budgets and bureaucracy, received a call that vaporized his understanding of how the world worked. An 8-figure donation was being wired to the hospital's endowment fund from an anonymous source. In return, he was to assemble his best staff, clear the entire top floor of the pediatric wing, and prepare for the arrival of a new, high-profile patient and her consulting team. The story was to be a last-minute opening in a clinical trial. The benefactor's name was never to be spoken. Hushed, frantic meetings took place in glass-walled offices. Nurses whispered in corridors. The administrative machine of the hospital, usually a slow, grinding behemoth, was kicked into a state of terrified, high-alert efficiency. By sunrise, as Maya was carefully choosing Lily's favorite sweater for the trip to the hospital, all the pieces on Alistair Vance's new board were in place. The specialists were in the air, a mobile command center of medical genius soaring at 41,000 feet, their faces illuminated by the glow of the medical files they were already studying. The hospital was ready, a stage perfectly set for a play whose final act no one could have ever predicted. The hospital corridor, usually a place of quiet, managed despair, felt different today. It was as if an invisible current of electricity was humming just beneath the polished linoleum floors. Maya walked beside Lily's wheelchair, her knuckles white as she clutched a thick, worn manila folder to her chest. Inside was every piece of paper that documented her sister's long, brutal war. Every lab result, every doctor's note, every scan. It was the story of their struggle, and she held it like a sacred text, a final offering to the gods of medicine. She had dressed Lily in her favorite blue sweater, the one that almost matched the color of her eyes, and had even managed to coax a small, hopeful smile from her. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a chaotic rhythm of hope and terror. This was it, the 10 o'clock assessment, the long shot, the miracle. She approached the familiar reception desk of the pediatric oncology wing, but the usual harried, tired-looking nurse was gone. In her place sat a woman with a calm, serene face and an impeccably crisp uniform. The woman looked up as they approached, and a small, professional smile touched her lips. "Maya Garcia," she said, her voice a soft, reassuring melody. "We have been expecting you." The word "we" hung in the air, a small but significant anomaly. Maya had expected a single doctor, a quick assessment, a mountain of paperwork. The nurse did not ask her to sign in or to take a seat in the waiting area, filled with worn magazines and anxious parents. Instead, she rose gracefully from her chair. "They are waiting for you in the consultation room," she said. "Please, follow me." She led them away from the familiar, noisy ward and down a corridor Maya had never seen before. It was quieter here, the lights softer, the air stiller. The rhythmic beeping of machines faded behind them, replaced by a profound, almost reverent silence. Each step echoed on the gleaming floor, a small, lonely sound in the vast, quiet space. Maya's cautious optimism began to curdle into a profound sense of disorientation. This was not the path to a clinical trial assessment. This felt like being escorted to a meeting of kings. The nurse finally stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the very end of the hall, a simple, elegant brass plaque on it that read only "Conference." She turned to Maya, her smile still in place, still utterly unreadable. She gestured toward the door. "Just go right in," she said softly. "They are ready for you." With a final, gentle nod, the nurse turned and walked away, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, leaving Maya and Lily alone in the silent corridor, standing before a door that held the answer to every prayer she had ever dared to whisper into the darkness. Her hand, slick with nervous sweat, trembled as she pushed down on the heavy brass handle. The oak door swung inward with a silent, expensive weight, revealing a scene so utterly incongruous, so profoundly impossible, that Maya's brain simply refused to process it. The room was not a small, sterile consultation office. It was a sprawling boardroom, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the soft, recessed lighting from the ceiling. Seated around this table were not one or two doctors, but at least a dozen men and women. They were dressed in sharp, professional attire, their faces a gallery of calm, focused intelligence. They looked like the kind of people who commanded lecture halls and appeared on the news, an assembly of profound importance. As one, they turned to look at her, their expressions not of judgment, but of a gentle, professional welcome that only deepened her confusion. And at the far end of the room, standing before a vast, floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, was him, Alistair Vance. He stood with his back partially to the room, a tall, dark silhouette against the bright afternoon sky. He was wearing a suit of the same impeccable cut, his posture radiating the same cold, absolute authority. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, those same glacial, steel-gray eyes, met hers across the vast, silent expanse. The manila folder, the heavy, precious record of her sister's life, slipped from her nerveless fingers and hit the plush carpet with a soft, dull thud. A tidal wave of contradictory emotions crashed over her, a chaotic storm of pure, unadulterated terror and dizzying, vertigo-inducing confusion. This was a nightmare. It had to be. This was some new, impossibly cruel form of torture he had devised, a psychological game to complete the destruction he had started in the restaurant. Her mind scrambled for a logical explanation, for any anchor in the swirling madness, and found none. And then, a single, horrifying thought pierced through the fog, a piece of ice in her gut. The last-minute opening, the private benefactor, the impossible, miraculous hope that had been handed to her. It was not a miracle. It was him. The realization was not a thought, but a physical impact, a blow that stole the air from her lungs and sent the room tilting on its axis. The man who had taken everything from her was also the man who had just offered her everything. The paradox was too vast, too monstrous to comprehend. She stood frozen in the doorway, a silent, unwilling actress who had just stumbled onto a stage where she did not know her lines, her part, or even the name of the play. The room was utterly silent. The doctors watched her. Lily looked up at her with trusting, innocent eyes. And Alistair Vance, the architect of both her ruin and her redemption, simply held her gaze, his expression a perfect, unreadable blank. The profound silence in the room was finally broken, not by a sound, but by a presence. Alistair Vance pushed himself away from the window, his movement a study in quiet, absolute control, and took 2 deliberate steps toward the table. The assembled doctors watched him, their collective attention a tangible force. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed solely on Maya, a laser of cold, analytical focus. When he spoke, his voice was calm, devoid of any discernible emotion, the same dispassionate tone he would use to dictate a corporate memo. "Your sister's medical care is no longer your concern," he stated, the words not a comfort but a simple declaration of a newly established fact. He gestured with one hand toward the silent assembly of specialists. "This is her new team. They are the best in the world. My company is funding it." The statement hung in the air, a monolithic block of information so immense it was impossible for Maya to process. Her mind, still reeling from the shock of his presence, could not even begin to parse the implications. "My company." He said it as if he were discussing a subsidiary, a minor acquisition. Then, his focus sharpened, his gaze narrowing on Maya with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "I have reviewed your academic record," he continued, his voice unchanged. The words sent a jolt of a new, different kind of fear through her. He had not just found her, he had excavated her past. "A mind like yours is a wasted asset." The phrase was a punch to the gut, a brutal, clinical assessment of her entire life since she had left Northwood. It was not an insult, it was worse. It was evaluation. "A full scholarship for you to complete your degree will be funded personally by me. Upon graduation, you will have a senior position at Vance Holdings in the Research and Development Division." He presented the offer not as a gift, but as a correction. It was a market adjustment. He was not apologizing for firing her, for humiliating her, for pushing her to the absolute brink. That event was a trivial, irrelevant data point. This was a strategic investment in an undervalued asset he had discovered. He was not giving her a future. He was informing her of the terms of her acquisition. He had taken her life apart, piece by piece, and was now reassembling it according to a new, more efficient design. The world, which had been frozen in a moment of impossible tension, suddenly thawed and flowed around Maya, leaving her isolated on an island of shock. The team of specialists, their focus shifting with the speed of a single, collective mind, turned away from her and toward a large screen that descended from the ceiling. Lily's medical files, the ones Maya had so carefully guarded in her manila folder, were already digitized and displayed in a series of complex charts and images. A quiet, professional murmur filled the room, a symphony of medical terminology as they began to dissect the disease, their voices a calm, confident current of intellectual power. They were already working. They were already saving her sister. The spectacle was so overwhelming, so complete, that it felt like watching a force of nature. Alistair Vance observed the scene for a single, satisfied moment, his work done, the system he had set in motion now operating with its intended efficiency. He turned, his movements economical and final, to leave. He had not offered a hand, he had not asked a single question about her well-being. He had delivered his terms and was now exiting the transaction. The sight of his retreating back finally broke through Maya's paralysis. A single word, small and fragile, escaped her lips, a whisper that was almost lost in the rising tide of the doctor's conversation. Why? It was not a question of logistics. It was a plea for a single drop of human understanding in an ocean of cold, hard calculation. Vance paused at the door, his hand on the handle, but he did not turn around. He did not grant her the small courtesy of looking at her when he delivered his answer, his motivation, his entire worldview in 3 short, brutal sentences. "My company does not invest in failures," he said, his voice a flat, dispassionate echo in the grand room. "It invests in assets. Do not prove me wrong." And then he was gone. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, a sound of absolute finality. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down Maya's face, but they were no longer tears of simple relief. She was saved. Her sister was saved. But she had been saved by a man who saw her not as a person, but as a line item on a balance sheet, a valuable commodity he had rescued from the scrap heap. She was a stock he had just acquired, and she would be expected to perform. 1 year later, the sun was warm on her face, a gentle, healing touch that felt like a promise. The world was no longer a place of grey, desperate survival, but a vibrant tapestry of green grass and the impossible blue of a cloudless sky. Maya sat on a park bench, the heavy, worn weight of the world a forgotten ghost, replaced by a profound sense of peace that had settled deep into her bones. A short distance away, a symphony of a child's laughter filled the air, the purest, most beautiful sound she had ever known. It was Lily. Not a pale, fragile Lily lost in a sea of white hospital sheets, but a vibrant, healthy Lily. Her brown hair, a flying banner as she chased a bright red ball across the lawn, her cheeks flushed with the joy of exertion. She was a living, breathing miracle, a testament to the strange, transactional bargain that had changed all of their lives. In Maya's lap rested a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled not with lists of debts or worries, but with the elegant, esoteric language of her true self. Intricate diagrams and complex equations flowed from her pen, lines and symbols that looked like a form of poetry, solutions to problems most people did not even know existed. She was not just a sister or a survivor anymore. She was a creator, a builder, an architect of the future, slowly, carefully, reclaiming the brilliant mind she had once been forced to set aside. Her phone, a sleek, new model she still felt awkward holding, buzzed on the bench beside her. A single text message had appeared on the screen, from a number identified only as Vance. It was not a conversation. It was a directive. A secure link to a new, cutting-edge corporate project involving quantum computing, and beneath it, a single line of text. Your division. When you are ready. It was not a question or an offer. It was a summons, a statement of fact from the man who had bought her future. A year ago, those words would have filled her with a cold, terrifying dread, but today, a slow, confident smile spread across her face. She looked at Lily, a beacon of impossible happiness, then back at the challenge waiting on her screen. She closed the notebook with a soft, final snap, the sound of a promise being kept. Her break was over. Her sister was safe, and she was, finally, ready to go to work. If this story touched your heart or made you look at the world differently, please show your support with a like and a comment below. Your engagement is what allows us to find and share more powerful stories like Maya's. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you're the first to see our next life-changing story. And finally, share this video. Share it as a reminder that the person pouring your coffee or the stranger you pass on the street is living a story as deep and complex as your own. A story of unseen battles and hidden brilliance, waiting for a single moment of recognition to change everything. Thank you for watching.